Look around the room you are sitting in right now. Take a long, quiet moment to really look at it. Examine the corners, the ceiling, the floor beneath you. You likely have 4 solid, unyielding walls. You have a stable, completely unmoving floor beneath your feet. You have a heavy engineered roof that protects you from the unpredictable, violent forces of the sky. When you lock your door at night, you feel safe, you feel grounded. For the vast majority of human history, the concept of a home has been explicitly designed to be a sanctuary. It is supposed to be a fortress of absolute certainty, a physical barrier meticulously built to keep the chaotic, dangerous, and deadly elements of the natural world firmly on the outside. But what if the very foundation of your home was a ticking geological time bomb? And what if the ceiling directly above your bed was a 1,000-ton granite boulder that could crush you and your entire family in the middle of the night without a single second of warning? And what if stepping out of your front door to get a breath of fresh air meant looking down a jagged abyss that stretches for hundreds of meters into a dark, freezing valley? Welcome to a deeply unsettling journey into the absolute extremes of human habitation. Today, we are going completely off the map to explore the 10 most dangerous, impossible, and terrifying homes on planet Earth. These are not just unusual houses. These are places where the fundamental laws of physics, the unpredictable forces of geology, and sheer basic common sense seem to have been completely ignored. These are places that will profoundly make you question just how far human beings will go to survive, and why on earth some people choose to live their entire lives on the very razor-thin edge of oblivion. You must stay with me, listening closely until the very end, because our #1 destination is a village sitting right inside the gaping, smoking mouth of an active, breathing volcano in the middle of a restless ocean. A place where the residents receive continuous, terrifying evacuation alerts, yet absolutely refuse to leave their ancestral home. Let us begin our descent into the bizarre and the perilous by leaving solid, comforting ground behind entirely. Number 10. Koh Panyee, Thailand. Hidden deep within the vast, shimmering emerald expanse of the Andaman Sea, floating directly in the imposing shadow of a colossal vertical limestone monolith, lies a village of roughly 2,000 people. But this village has absolutely no ground, not a single inch of dirt, soil, or stone. And Koh Panyee is a sprawling, chaotic wooden labyrinth of dense houses, bustling, crowded markets, a glowing mosque with golden domes, and a vibrant local school, entirely suspended over the ocean on thousands of thin, fragile wooden stilts. There are no paved streets here. The avenues are rushing deep seawater. The only vehicles you will ever hear are the narrow wooden long-tail boats equipped with roaring, sputtering diesel engines. And the story of this impossible floating city goes back roughly 2 centuries, and it is a story of legal defiance and desperate survival. A group of Malay Muslim fishermen, fleeing hardship, arrived in this breathtaking but unforgiving bay seeking a new life. However, strict Thai laws at the time explicitly and harshly forbade anyone without full Thai citizenship from owning a single inch of dry land. They were trapped. They could not sail the open ocean forever, but they were legally barred from ever stepping foot on the shore to build a life. And so, they found a brilliant, audacious loophole. If the law said they could not build on the land, they would build their homes on the sea itself. They rowed out into the shallow waters beneath the towering limestone cliffs, places where the water was just shallow enough, and began driving heavy wooden poles deep into the treacherous, muddy seafloor. They built a single, small wooden platform. Over 200 years, that single isolated platform grew like a massive living organism across the water. But pause for a moment and imagine the profound psychological toll of living your entire life suspended just a few feet above the ocean tide. Every major, violent storm that rolls in from the Andaman Sea brings crashing waves that violently batter the wooden supports beneath their beds. The salt water constantly, aggressively rots the wood, requiring endless and highly dangerous maintenance diving just to keep the village from collapsing into the sea. Yet, from this treacherous, swaying platform, they built a thriving community. The children of Koh Panyee even built a floating football pitch out of scavenged, rotting wood and rusty nails, just so they could play. It bobbed dangerously on the ocean waves, slippery and uneven, throwing children into the dark water during matches. But they learned to balance, they learned to adapt, and they thrived on a world that stubbornly, permanently refuses to stand still. If Koh Panyee was a village built to skirt a law, our next watery destination was built to escape a horrifying slaughter. Number 9. Ganvié, Benin, sprawling across the murky, dark, and shallow waters of Lake Nokwe in the southern region of the African continent, is a sprawling city of 30,000 souls. Like Koh Panyee, it completely balances on thin, fragile wooden poles. And tourists often enthusiastically refer to it as the Venice of Africa, completely captivated by the colorful canoes and the rippling water. But there is absolutely no romance in its dark, terrifying origin story. Over 400 years ago, in the violent and turbulent 17th century, the Tofinu people were being ruthlessly and systematically hunted. The ferocious, highly organized, and brutal warriors of the Dahomey Kingdom were sweeping across the land. They were capturing rival tribal groups, burning villages to the ground, and dragging the survivors in heavy iron chains to the coast, where brutal European slave ships waited to take them away forever. Extermination or a lifetime of horrific slavery were their only two options on land. But in their absolute darkest desperation, the Tofinu discovered a crucial, life-saving weakness in their powerful enemy. The terrifying Dahomey warriors held a deep, paralyzing, and absolute religious fear of water. Their spiritual beliefs strictly dictated that a terrible, wrathful demon resided deep within the lake, and entering the water would bring a curse upon their bloodline. Knowing this, the Tofinu made a desperate, massive exodus. They abandoned their farms, they abandoned the solid earth entirely, and moved their entire civilization into the murky water. They drove hardwood trunks deep into the muddy lake bed and built a city that their hunters could clearly see from the muddy shore, but absolutely dared not reach. To this day, the entire sprawling city remains on those stilts. The water saved them, but the danger of living here has never truly faded. It has only changed forms. The heavy hardwood stilts, despite their incredible resilience, eventually rot in the dark, warm, bacteria-rich water. When a pole weakens, the residents must drive a new one into the mud right beside the old one, causing the houses to subtly, continuously shift and migrate across the surface of the lake over generations. Furthermore, when the aggressive torrential rainy season arrives, the shallow lake violently swells. The water level rises dramatically, sometimes by several meters, entirely flooding the lower floors of the homes. The residents are forced to frantically pack up their meager belongings, retreat to the upper, cramped in the damp, terrifying darkness for weeks, until the water finally decides to recede. Ganvié is a visually stunning city, but you must remember that it is fundamentally a fortress, a fortress built on the deep, ancestral trauma of being hunted. From the shifting dark and flood-prone waters of the sea and lakes, we now completely shift our environment to a place entirely starved of water, a place where the blistering sun is the ultimate enemy. Number 8. Matmata, Tunisia. Imagine walking across a blistering, completely barren desert landscape in North Africa. The midday sun beats down without a single ounce of mercy, baking the earth until it cracks. The horizon is empty, flat, and completely devoid of life. The surface temperature during the brutal Saharan summer easily and frequently exceeds 50 degrees Celsius, a heat so oppressive, so suffocating, it feels as though the air itself is literally boiling your lungs. But beneath your very feet, completely hidden from the scorching surface world, hundreds of people are living their lives in cool, quiet shadows. In 1976, a young filmmaker named George Lucas wandered into this desolate landscape looking for an alien planet to film his new movie, Star Wars. He was searching for an environment that looked like it did not belong on Earth. He found Matmata. These incredible subterranean homes were not built by aliens, nor were they the product of Hollywood set designers. They were meticulous, painstakingly carved by human hands over 700 years ago. The indigenous Berber people of this region, facing a climate that actively tried to kill them every single day, realized that long-term survival on the surface was a mathematical impossibility. So, they made a radical decision. They dug straight down. Using primitive hand tools, they carved massive, perfectly circular pits 10 meters deep and often 15 meters wide, straight down into the soft sandstone earth. From the bottom of these central craters, which act as open-air courtyards, they hollowed out horizontal tunnels, kitchens, and living quarters deep into the walls of the pit. The earth itself became their ultimate life-saving insulation. While a literal furnace rages on the surface above, the temperature inside these troglodyte homes remains at a completely stable, beautifully cool 20 degrees year-round. But there is a terrifying, exhausting reality to living inside the earth. The sandstone that makes this digging possible is incredibly soft. It is fragile. It slowly, constantly erodes with the passage of time and the whispering desert winds. When the rare torrential rains finally come to the Sahara, these massive pits turn into perilous bowls that catch the violent floodwaters. The walls soften, weaken, and slowly melt away like sugar in tea. The families who live here are locked in a perpetual, exhausting, multi-generational war with the very earth they call home. They must constantly recut, scrape, reinforce, and rebuild their walls. They live in a constant state of excavation, and fighting year after year just to keep the desert from collapsing inward and burying them alive in their sleep. From the flat, suffocating depths of the sandy desert, we now ascend high into the jagged, imposing, and treacherous peaks of the mountains. Number 7. Masuleh, Iran. Deep within the imposing Alborz Mountains of northern Iran, completely cloaked in thick, haunting, freezing fogs for much of the year, there is a village built on a slope so violently steep that its very existence defies all known architectural logic. In Masuleh, the layout is so incredibly compressed and vertical that the roof of your house is literally the front yard and the public street for the house directly above you. The buildings are stacked upon each other in a dizzying, continuous vertical chain. And to traverse this village, to go to the market or visit a friend, you do not walk on paved roads. You literally walk across the ceilings of your neighbors. And what functions as a busy pedestrian walkway at one elevation is the exact ceiling, protecting a family eating dinner at the elevation immediately below. And according to deep historical records, this village was not built on this perilous cliff by accident. 1,000 years ago, the original ancestors of this community lived in a different flat settlement, one that was completely decimated by a horrifying, highly contagious epidemic and brutal attacks from neighboring warlords. The traumatized, desperate survivors fled as high into the mountains as they could possibly go. They deliberately chose this treacherous vertical terrain because it made it mathematically impossible for any invading army to mount a cavalry attack. But the steep slope that protected them also imprisoned them. Because of the extreme, almost 90-degree angle of the mountain, there are absolutely no cars in Masuleh. A single misstep by a vehicle would send it tumbling hundreds of meters down the jagged rock face into the valley below. This means that every single brick, every heavy bag of modern cement, every massive piece of timber, and every piece of daily cargo must be carried up this agonizing vertical maze by pure human strength or by exhausted, heavy-breathing donkeys. And the danger of the environment is ever present. The houses are constructed of ancient clay, stone, and heavy timber. When the brutal winter snows rapidly melt, or the heavy spring rains come, violent, unstoppable torrents of water cascade directly down the mountain, rushing aggressively over the rooftops and tearing through the narrow walkways. The ancient clay walls absorb the heavy moisture, swelling, cracking, and weakening. Structural collapses are a grim expected reality. Roof suddenly cave in under the weight of wet snow, walls give way. Yet, the fiercely proud residents simply clear the rubble, mix new clay, and rebuild exactly where the old house stood, continuing to live out their days constantly aware of the sheer drop just inches from their front doors. If living on a fragile, waterlogged clay roof sounds unnerving to you, imagine living directly beneath a natural structure so massively heavy it could flatten your entire existence into dust in a fraction of a second. Number 6. Monsanto, Portugal. High up in the rugged and wind-swept Serra da Estrela Mountains near the Spanish border, there sits a village that looks as though it was built by colossal, angry giants who haphazardly dropped massive granite boulders across the landscape and simply walked away. Some of these boulders are the size of multi-story apartment buildings. They weigh thousands upon thousands of tons. They sit perched on the steep hillside in arrangements that appear terrifyingly random, deposited by violent geological processes millions of years ago. Centuries ago, the earliest people of Monsanto looked at these terrifying, precarious rocks that look like they could snap and roll down the hill at any given moment, and made an utterly unthinkable, bizarre decision. They decided to build their homes directly underneath them. They did not attempt to carve or move the rocks. They simply adapted to them. They used the colossal boulders as solid walls, as unyielding floors, and most terrifyingly, as their roofs. Wandering through the narrow, winding cobblestone streets of Monsanto, you will see medieval wooden doors leading straight into solid, unmoving rock. You will see giant, rounded granite spheres resting precisely over living rooms, kitchens, and family bedrooms. completely trapping the inhabitants beneath thousands of tons of ancient stone. And imagine lying in your bed at night in absolute pitch blackness, looking up and knowing that your ceiling is made of a single piece of granite that weighs more than a commercial airliner. A boulder held back from crushing you only by the microscopic friction of an ancient geological placement that happened millions of years before humanity even existed. A minor earthquake, a slight shifting of the wet soil beneath it, a sudden erosion, and the boulder would simply end everything below it in an instant. For the residents who have lived here for generations, it is entirely normal. The rocks are viewed as their silent protective guardians, but for anyone visiting, it is a haunting, claustrophobic, and heavy reminder of our extreme physical fragility beneath the sheer, crushing, unstoppable mass of nature. From homes trapped beneath crushing stones, we move to a massive subterranean fortress that was violently, tragically, and suddenly torn open by the earth itself. Number 5. Vardzia, Georgia. In the turbulent, bloody 12th century, the legendary Queen Tamar of Georgia, one of the most powerful, brilliant, and revered monarchs in medieval history, ordered the construction of a city that absolutely no invading army could ever find. She did not build massive stone walls on a hill. She commanded her royal engineers to carve an entire sprawling metropolis deep inside the dark, solid bowels of the Erusheti mountain. It was a masterpiece of paranoia, military strategy, and absolute secrecy. At its peak, this hidden underground fortress housed over 50,000 people. It spanned 13 distinct underground levels, plunging deep into the stone. It contained over 6,000 separate rooms, a complex gravity-fed irrigation system that brought fresh, freezing spring water through the dark, and a magnificent, cavernous hidden church adorned with intricate gold frescoes. The city was practically invisible. From the outside valley, the massive cliff face appeared entirely natural, completely unbroken rock. The secret entrances were heavily concealed. It was an impregnable, unseen ghost city where an entire civilization could survive a brutal siege for years without ever seeing the sun, until the catastrophic, apocalyptic year of 1283. Without a single moment of warning, a massive earthquake violently ripped through the region. The sheer, terrifying violence of the seismic tremor sheared the entire outer face of the mountain completely away. Millions of tons of rock detached and crashed into the valley below with a deafening roar. In a matter of seconds, the secret city that had been perfectly hidden inside the mountain was violently exposed to the open air. Its intimate rooms, its dark tunnels, and its terrified people were suddenly visible from miles away. The ultimate defensive advantage simply vanished in a massive cloud of dust. Because the mountain was split open, the city was entirely doomed. Centuries later, the invading Persian forces effortlessly spotted the exposed rooms. They easily scaled the rubble, entered the exposed tunnels, and mercilessly slaughtered the monks and citizens who had remained, completely sacking and burning the remnants of the city. Today, you can navigate the narrow, dark internal tunnels that suddenly, terrifyingly open up to massive sheer drops where the mountain face simply fell away. Queen Tamar built a brilliant city inside a mountain to protect her people forever. But Vardzia stands as a chilling, monumental reminder that no matter how brilliant human engineering is, the earth can simply shrug and destroy it all. With their mountain fortress destroyed and exposed, where could humanity possibly hide next? They looked up, straight up into the unforgiving, dizzying sky. Number 4. The Meteora monasteries of Greece. Rising abruptly and violently from the flat, sweeping plains of central Greece are monolithic, otherworldly sandstone pillars. These natural rock towers shoot over 300 meters straight up into the clouds. The rock faces are completely smooth, perfectly vertical, and utterly deadly to climb. Yet, resting precariously on the very flat, tiny summits of these massive spikes are sprawling Eastern Orthodox monasteries. They look like grand crowns placed there by the hands of gods. In the chaotic, violent 14th century, the Byzantine Empire was crumbling. Ascetic monks desperately seeking absolute, pure isolation from the bloody conflicts, the invading armies, and the perceived sins of the world below, looked at these impossible pillars and decided to conquer them. They had no modern cranes, they had no helicopters, they had absolutely no modern engineering knowledge. Every single heavy stone, every massive wooden beam, every piece of lead for the roof, and every drop of water had to be hauled up vertically in massive, heavy nets pulled by hand-cranked wooden windlasses situated at the very edge of the precipice. The monks themselves ascended and descended by climbing terrifying, swaying rope ladders that hung hundreds of meters in the open air, constantly battered by extreme, freezing mountain winds. The psychological terror of this ascent cannot be overstated. Imagine hanging onto a fraying hemp rope 300 meters above jagged rocks, with the wind threatening to rip you away. According to a famous historical account, a nervous visitor preparing to be hauled up in a rope net once looked at the old, fraying ropes and asked the presiding monk how often they were replaced. The monk stared back coldly, completely devoid of emotion, and replied, "Only when the Lord lets them break." For centuries, these men lived like isolated eagles, surviving simply because no army on earth could figure out how to reach them without being shot off the ropes. Taking the extreme, dizzying isolation of Meteora and pushing it further into the thin, freezing, oxygen-deprived air of the Himalayas, we find our next location. Number 3. The Tiger's Nest Monastery, Bhutan. Clinging desperately to a vertical, pitch-black rock cliff face at a staggering elevation of over 3,000 meters above sea level. This monastery sits an unbelievable, terrifying 900 meters straight up from the Paro Valley floor below. From the high mountain trail approaching it, it looks less like a man-made building and more like a white scar, a magical structure placed there by a force that simply refuses to acknowledge the laws of gravity. According to deep Bhutanese religious mythology, in the 8th century, the revered Guru Rinpoche flew to this exact impossible spot on the back of a flaming flying tigress. He landed on the sheer cliff and meditated in a small, freezing cave for 3 years, 3 months, 3 weeks, 3 days, and 3 hours to subdue the evil demons of the valley. Because this exact spot was deemed profoundly sacred, and the Bhutanese people decided they had to build a grand monastery completely surrounding that cliffside cave. Getting to this monastery requires a grueling multi-hour trek up a steep, lung-busting mountain trail through incredibly thin air. There is no modern road, there is no cable car. In 1998, a devastating disaster struck. A massive fire, likely caused by a simple butter lamp, swept through the main structures. Because it was hanging on a cliff, fire engines could not possibly reach it. The monastery burned, threatening to detach and fall into the valley. When the government ordered its absolute reconstruction, they faced the exact same logistical nightmare as the original builders. Every single heavy wooden beam, every stone block, and every delicate piece of gold leaf had to be painstakingly carried up the mountain by human hands and mules along a narrow path that drops hundreds of meters into the valley. The monks who live here today brave brutally freezing winters, completely isolated from the modern world, enduring extreme isolation and the constant biting threat of the Himalayan elements, all simply to live in the exact, terrifying spot where a legendary tiger once landed. But if the tiger's nest sits atop a tiny, perilous ledge, our next location doesn't even have a ledge. It is desperately, agonizingly clinging to the very edge of the world, suspended entirely in the void. Number 2. The Hanging Temple of Datong, China. Etched directly into the sheer 90-degree vertical drop of a canyon wall in Shaanxi province is a wooden structure that has completely baffled structural engineers for over a millennium. Suspended a dizzying 75 meters above the jagged, rocky valley floor, it is literally, inexplicably pinned to the completely flat cliff face. Built over 1,500 years ago by a visionary, brilliant monk named Liao Ran, the temple relies entirely on long wooden beams driven horizontally deep into holes chiseled by hand into the solid rock. From the valley floor below, it looks like a terrifying optical illusion. The thin, aging wooden beams appear violently, almost comically inadequate to hold the massive structure containing 40 separate rooms. It looks as though a strong gust of wind would peel the entire temple off the rock face and send it crashing into the gorge. But when you actually dare to walk its narrow external corridors, the terror becomes visceral, raw, and deeply psychological. The ancient wooden floorboards actively creak, groan, and flex beneath your feet with every single step. In several sections, the walkways are incredibly narrow, and there are absolutely no safety railings to separate you from the 75-meter plunge into the absolute abyss. Modern engineers discovered its terrifying secret. The crossbeams are anchored incredibly deep inside the mountain itself, using the sheer weight of the rock to counterbalance the temple. It is a masterpiece of architectural defiance. Liao Ran designed it to house Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian shrines all together, placing them suspended in the void to represent a spiritual space halfway between heaven and earth. It is profoundly beautiful, but make no mistake, every single step taken inside this 500-year-old hanging wooden box is an absolute, heart-pounding, terrifying test of human nerves. And finally, we reach the edge of absolute reason. The most dangerous, terrifying, and incomprehensible home on Earth. Number 1. Aogashima, Japan. Imagine looking at a satellite map and finding a tiny, incredibly isolated island sitting entirely alone in the massive dark expanse of the Philippine Sea. As you zoom in, you realize it is not just a tropical island. It is a volcano, a massive, towering, sheer-walled caldera jutting violently out of the ocean. But as you look even closer, peering right down into the absolute center of the crater, you see something mathematically and logically impossible. Right inside the mouth of the volcano, trapped perfectly between the towering, unscalable outer rim and the smoking, geologically active inner volcanic cone, there is a fully functioning village. 170 human beings live permanently inside a Class C active volcano. They sleep, they farm their vegetables, they build their houses, and they raise their children directly in the belly of the beast. They are living in the exact space where magma is meant to explode. In 1785, Aogashima violently and catastrophically erupted. The ground shook, the sky turned completely black, and a horrifying storm of ash, toxic gas, and boiling magma rained down on the people trapped inside the bowl. The eruption slaughtered exactly half of the island's population. The panicked survivors managed to flee to boats, watching their home burn from the sea. The island was completely abandoned and declared a toxic dead zone. Yet 50 years later, drawn by an inexplicable, stubborn, and deeply human pull to their ancestral land, the descendants of those survivors returned. They sailed back, climbed into the crater, and rebuilt their homes in the exact, precise spot where their grandfathers had burned to death. Access today is a logistical nightmare. You must rely on a small helicopter frequently grounded by thick ocean fog, or a supply ship that must navigate violent ocean currents to dock against a vertical cliff. Over a third of the time, the ocean is too violent and the ship simply cannot dock. When that happens, the island is completely and totally cut off from the rest of humanity. The residents use the geothermal steam constantly leaking from vents in the ground to cook their food, a hissing, physical reminder of the unimaginable heat churning just below their floorboards. The Japanese Meteorological Agency monitors the tremors continuously. The residents receive terrifying alerts when seismic activity inevitably spikes. But the grim reality is that if a major eruption happens during a typhoon, when the ships cannot sail and helicopters cannot fly, there is no way out. They are trapped inside the walls of the caldera. They live every single day inside a loaded geological gun, waiting for the trigger to be pulled, and yet they completely refuse to leave. From floating wooden villages battered by violent ocean storms, to ancient underground tunnels slowly crumbling in the desert, to monasteries hanging by a thread in the sky, and finally to a ticking volcanic bomb in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, these 10 locations prove one terrifying, undeniable truth about humanity. We will stubbornly, fiercely, and defiantly build a home absolutely anywhere. We will fight the desert, we will build on the ocean, we will hang off cliffs, and we will sleep inside volcanoes. The earth shakes, the mountains crumble, the oceans aggressively rise, and the volcanoes explode. But human beings simply adapt, rebuild, and completely refuse to surrender the places they call home. Which of these perilous, impossible homes would you actually dare to sleep in for a single night? And which one makes your blood run completely cold just looking at it? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you have survived this incredible, terrifying journey with me to the very end, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because our next destination will take us even further into the unknown. Until then, take a long moment to deeply appreciate the solid, safe, unmoving ground beneath your feet.